Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday? Yehud in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Guy in Ohio, John in Maine, Joe in the Inland Empire, Ryan in Florida, Billy in Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella, Spencer in Connecticut, Yisrael in Philadelphia, Aoife in Florida, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Doubled off and still a short class. Always taking advantage when we can get ahead, because you never know what is ahead. And also, in this doubled off, we will be doing the 1699th and the 1700th page of Talmud Bavli. There are 2,711 pages in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud. So we've reached 1,700, just about 1,000 to go, and well past the halfway point. 1,700 out of 2,700. Somebody do the math. I don't know where we are. 60%, something like that. Cool. So pages 65 and 66 here in Tractate Bava Basra. Opening Mishna number 3 here in chapter 4. Mishnah 3. One who sells a house has, as part of the sale, sold also the door, but not the key. So right away we're thinking the key in Talmudic times did not have the same form as the key of today. The key was more like an integrated part of the locking mechanism of the door, but it wasn't like a small little key that you carried around in your pocket to open the lock when you got home. That's not what a key was. A key was a much larger type of item, and as we're learning, not considered an integral part of the door and its locking mechanism. Although, even in Talmudic times, it would seem like the technology, so to speak, was evolving, as we'll see when we get to the Gemara. But according to the Mishnah, if you sell a house, you have sold the door, even though the door could be detached, it could come off the hinges, but the door comes with the house, the key not necessarily included, unless you negotiated for that. He has sold the mortar that is fixed in the ground, because that's an integral part of the house, but not the portable mortar. He has sold the immovable lower millstone, but not the portable upper millstone. But not the portable upper stone, the funnel into which one pours the grain to be ground, right? So there's the funnel that goes into the millstone between the two stones, where you funnel in the grain that is ground between the two stones, and that funnel is not sold. That is considered part of the portable upper stone, and is not necessarily included in the house unless they negotiated for that. And the seller has sold neither the oven nor the double stove, as they are deemed movable. And when the seller says to the buyer, I am selling you it and everything that is in it, then all these components are sold as part of the house. So of course you could sell the key and the oven and the upper millstone along with the house, but that is not necessarily included if all the buyer and seller talked about was the house. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, and we're on page 65b. The Gemara suggests, let us say that the Mishnah that distinguishes between different types of household items is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. As, if it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, doesn't he say in a Barais on page 78b that if one sold a vineyard, he has sold all the utensils of the vineyard, including the movable ones? So the same should be true of the house. If Rabbi Meir says that when you sell a vineyard, it comes with all the tools used in the vineyard, then why, if you're selling a house, would it not come with all the usual, even movable appurtenances that accompany the house? It would seem that our Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Meir. And now that we've been through this a bunch of times, and these kinds of reasoning, this type of reasoning, so we could guess ahead and say, well, even if Rabbi Meir says that a vineyard comes with all its appurtenances, that doesn't mean that a house is the same, because a house and a vineyard are different. So let's see how a house and a vineyard are different. And if indeed they are different, we haven't learned anything about whether this Mishnah about what a house comes with agrees or disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Meir with regard to a vineyard. So let's keep reading. The Gemara answers, you may even say that the Mishnah was taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as a distinction can be made between the two cases. There, in the case of a vineyard, the reference is to utensils that are fixed in the vineyard and never removed from that vineyard, and therefore they are included in the sale. While here, in the case of a house, the Mishnah is referring to utensils that are not fixed in the house, and therefore they are not part of the sale. So the Gemara immediately objects. But doesn't the Mishnah teach the law governing a key in similar fashion to the law governing the door? Indicating that just as a door is considered fixed in the house, so too a key is fixed in the house. So rather, it is clear that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, in Tosefta 3:1, one who sells a house has sold the door and the door bolt and the lock, but he has not sold the key. You would think that if you're selling the lock, you're selling the key, but no, it's not like the little keys in our pockets. He has sold the mortar that was hollowed out of the ground, but not the mortar that was fixed to the ground after its construction. He has sold the immovable lower millstone, but not the portable upper stone. And he has sold neither the oven, nor the double stove, nor the hand mill. And Rabbi Eliezer says the principle is that any item attached to the ground is considered like the ground and included in the sale. When the seller says to the buyer, I am selling you it and everything that is in it, then all these components are sold along with the house. But in this case and in that case, he did not sell the pit or the cistern or the gallery, as they are considered separate entities that are not at all part of the house, as we've learned in the last couple weeks. Now, the sages taught in a Baraisa. Now we're going to do a little bit of a digression. But I think that even though it sounds crazy to us, the lock without the key, and I keep mentioning the key was not the kind of key like we imagine today, and even so, it's not so foreign. Right? I mean, when you sell a house, you and the buyer are going to agree on what's going to come with the house. Now, a stove, a fridge, especially a kind of built-in fridge, that's a sort of thing that you would think will come with the house, but not necessarily. Somebody might think, he's lived in that house for a long time. He spent a ton of money on that fridge. That fridge is going to work very well in his new house. He's shipping all his other furniture to the new house. He'll ship the fridge too. So there's no reason to assume that you're getting that fridge unless you come to an agreement. Right? You have to make sure that you get what you think you're getting and that you're selling what you think you're selling. And it's when these terms are left vague that you would have these kinds of problems. And what we're learning is what is considered integral to a house. Really, it's what's built in at a sort of construction level, not necessarily what's installed later. Not necessarily. Okay, now a new subject. The sages taught in a baraisa a duct that one hollowed out and afterward attached to the ground. And it's because we're talking about something that's attached to the ground or not attached to the ground. That's what we were talking about in what is sold along with a house. And now we're going to make a digression on other halachic, that is to say, Jewish legal ramifications of whether something is attached to the ground or not. Specifically, how this affects whether the water that enters a mikvah is considered rainwater flowing into the mikvah. That is the kind of water that a mikvah needs, as opposed to drawn water, which can invalidate the mikvah. And in the case of something that becomes detached from the ground on Shabbos, which you're not allowed to do, right? Bottom line, you can't harvest anything. You can't take a leaf, you can't take a lemon, you can't take an orange, you can't take any fruit off a tree on Shabbos because that's considered harvesting. So that's obviously something that's attached to the ground. But what about where it's not so obvious? Okay. So the sages taught in a baraisa a duct that one hollowed out and afterward attached to the ground or to a building invalidates a ritual bath, meaning a mikvah, through the water that it channels into the mikvah. So the water in a mikvah must be gathered directly either from rain or from a stream and not drawn with vessels, right? You can't collect rainwater in a barrel and then use that to fill the mikvah. The water has to flow into the mikvah. It can sort of flow off a rooftop or something, but it has to flow directly into the mikvah, or it can be diverted from a stream, etc. You can also do you can immerse the way you immerse in a mikvah, you can immerse in a river or in the ocean. But when we're talking about a mikvah that is collected water, it has to be collected in such a way that the water flows directly into it and is not drawn from some other container. Okay, so what they're saying here is that if you take this duct, and the duct, is sort of like channeling the water to the mikvah, all good, the mikvah's good. But if you take that duct and you attach it to the ground and you put a kind of filtration system there so that stuff goes flowing one way or another, that has the possibility to invalidate this mikvah, at least in terms of that particular portion of the water that flows through that duct. Now, the nuances of what makes a mikvah kosher or not kosher are many, are deep, and are beyond the scope of today's class. So for this point, we're just talking about this one duct and whether it's attached to the ground or not. All right, so if one hollowed out a log and used it to channel water into the mikvah, so this is considered drawn water as he used a vessel. By contrast, if one attached it first and afterward hollowed it out, it does not invalidate the mikvah. Before the log was hollowed out, it was already attached to and considered part of the ground, and therefore the act of hollowing it out does not turn it into a vessel. And the Gemara asks, with whose opinion is this? It appears to be neither the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer nor that of the rabbis. So the Gemara clarifies its question. To which opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is this referring? If we say it is referring to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the aforementioned baraisa, with regard to the sale of a house, that any item attached to the ground is considered part of the house and is sold along with the house, So there is a difficulty, as perhaps this is the reasoning employed in a dispute with regard to the sale of a house, that Rabbi Eliezer holds that one who sells generously, and anything that is attached to the ground will go along with the sale, while the rabbis hold that one who sells sparingly, selling only utensils that served an intrinsic function in the house and nothing else, even if they are attached to the ground. But this teaches us nothing about the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis with respect to a mikvah, but rather the reference must be to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer concerning a beehive. As we learned in a Mishna, tractate Shevit 10:7, with regard to a beehive attached to the ground by clay, Rabbi Eliezer says it is like land, and therefore one may write a document that prevents the sabbatical year from canceling an outstanding debt, that's called the prosbul, based upon it. In other words, this idea that the 7-year Shemitah cycle, that when the Shemitah arrives, the sabbatical year, the 7th year, all debts are canceled, sounds good. Wow, poor people are going to have all their debts forgiven in the 7th year. But the result of that is that in the 5th and 6th year, poor people can't borrow money because people who have money don't want to lend to them lest that debt be canceled by the arrival of the 7th year. So it's a kind of a law that sounded good, but ends up not working for the poor people. So the sages instituted the prosbul, which was a legal device which would allow poor people or anybody to borrow money even as their 7th year was approaching, because the debt would not be canceled in the 7th year. And what was the basis of not canceling it? Basically that the debt would be transferred, it is not owed directly to the person. The borrower does not owe the money directly to the lender. Instead, the legal device makes a situation where the borrower owes that money to the court, and the court will transfer the money when it receives it to the lender. But for this device to work, the borrower actually has to own some amount of property. He has to own some amount of land. What you're hearing here is, if all he owns is a beehive, is that considered owning land or not? Well, many beehives, perhaps most beehives that beekeepers keep, are portable, right? They're in boxes, they can move the boxes. But we know that bees set up shop, as it were, sometimes in the walls of a house, sometimes in a tree. They don't consider their beehive to be portable. You know, a beekeeper may come along and smoke them out, take the queen and move the beehive. But for the most part, a beehive can be something that is fixed to the ground, especially if there's some kind of a more permanent attachment like this clay that they're talking about. So if the beehive is attached to the ground, even though it's a very small amount of land, right, that is holding the beehive, but if it's considered that that land belongs to the owner of the beehive, then that's enough for him to be able to borrow money and use the prosbul, so that he has the ability to borrow money even with the 7th year approaching. And that's how the beehive connects with the sabbatical year. And it's coming up now because it only works if it's attached to the ground. Now we're on page 66a. And such a beehive is not susceptible to ritual impurity as long as it is fixed in its place. Like a tree does not become tumah, though a wood utensil can become tumah, can become ritually impure. But while it's still wood attached to the ground, it does not have the possibility to become impure. And they're saying that a beehive, if it's considered attached to the ground for the purposes of backing up a prosbul, then it is also considered attached to the ground in that it cannot become tumah, cannot become ritually impure. And further corollary, and one who removes honey from it on Shabbos is liable to bring a sin offering, as he is likened to one who harvests produce attached to the ground. Now that's interesting because he didn't harvest produce that was attached to the ground. He took honey from a beehive. But if we're going to say that a beehive attached to the ground is considered something that is attached to the ground, then taking honey from it is going to be likened to taking fruit from a tree, right? It's obviously not the same as taking fruit from a tree. You're not breaking anything off, but you are scooping out the honey. So obviously it's not by Torah law, but rather by rabbinic decree that they're going to say that taking honey from a beehive on Shabbos is too similar to the prohibited labor of harvesting, and therefore you don't take honey from a beehive on Shabbos. Certainly not from a beehive that's attached to the ground. We haven't actually addressed the question, well, what about a portable beehive, one that's just in a box and is not attached to the ground? We haven't addressed that yet. So that's according to Rabbi Eliezer. But the rabbis say such a beehive, even if it is attached to the ground, is not like land. And therefore, one may not write a prosbul based upon it. And it is susceptible to ritual impurity, even when it is fixed in its place. And one who removes honey from it on Shabbos is exempt from bringing a sin offering. So this Mishna suggests that Rabbi Eliezer holds that a vessel that was fixed to the ground is considered like land for all purposes. And this contradicts the Baraisa that states that if one hollowed out a pipe and then affixed it to the ground, it is still considered a vessel. And water flowing through it is considered drawn water that invalidates a mikvah. This indicates that the Baraisa was not taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. But the Gemara rejects this opinion, stating that there in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer treats the beehive like land for the reason that Rabbi Elazar stated, and not because he holds that all vessels that are affixed to the ground are considered like land. As Rabbi Elazar stated, what is the reasoning for the statement of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to one who removes honey from a beehive? His rationale is as it is written, quote, and he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb. From 1 Samuel 14:27. So Rabbi Eliezer understands that since the Hebrew words used here, Ya'arat hadevash, which Ya'arat hadevash, which is the word describing a honeycomb, can also mean honey forest. And the verse comes to teach that just as with regard to a forest, one who picks anything from a tree on Shabbos is liable to bring a sin offering, so too with regard to a beehive containing honey, one who removes honey from it on Shabbos is liable to bring a sin offering, as the beehive is treated like land. So the beehive is treated like land, whether it's attached to the ground or not. And this is simply based on the terminology, the Hebrew terminology in the Bible that sort of makes a language connection between a beehive and trees in a forest. So consequently, Rabbi Eliezer relies here on a special derivation which does not necessarily apply to other vessels. Therefore, nothing can be learned from this about Rabbi Eliezer's opinion with regard to the pipe that brings water to a mikvah. So rather, the reference with regard to the hollowed out duct must be to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer concerning a baker's board on which he kneads the dough, as we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Kelim, with regard to a baker's board, Dav Shel Nachtomen, that was affixed to the wall. So Rabbi Eliezer renders it not susceptible to tumah, to ritual impurity, while the rabbis render it susceptible to ritual impurity. And this seems to indicate that according to Rabbi Eliezer, anything that is affixed to the ground or to something else that is affixed to the ground is treated like land, and therefore it cannot become tameh. And having concluded that this is the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis that was referred to previously, the Gemara repeats the question raised earlier about the ruling in the Baraisa with regard to a duct. Whose opinion is it? It appears to be neither the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer nor that of the rabbis. As if it is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, then even if one hollowed out a duct and afterward he affixed it to the ground, water flowing through it should not be considered drawn water that invalidates a mikvah. As according to Rabbi Eliezer, a baker's board that was first a vessel but then became fixed to a wall is treated like land. And if it is the opinion of the rabbis, then even if he first fixed the duct to the ground and only afterward he hollowed it out, the duct should also be treated like a vessel, and the water flowing through it should be considered drawn water, as the rabbis do not differentiate with regard to the stage at which the baker's board was affixed to the wall. Now, what we're getting at here is, and we're going to see it in a moment, you could take wood, right? So wood, can wood become tameh? It can if it's a utensil it can be used to hold something else. So, for example, if you have a wood bowl, so that's a utensil that can hold something, and therefore it can become tameh. But if it's a flat wood board, like a cutting board, interesting. I don't know. I'm not saying that this is the law with respect to kashrus, etc., and whether it needs to be toiveled, whether it needs to be immersed in a mikvah when you bring it into a house. I think you do. But just according to this law that we're talking about right now, a flat board does not have any kind of concavity. It doesn't have the ability to hold something else, and therefore it is not susceptible to tumah unless you don't use it as a bowl, but rather you use it as a seat. If you can sit on it, then, like other pieces of wood furniture, it can become tameh from somebody sitting on it. But if we're just talking about a piece of wood that's a flat board and is not some kind of a bowl, then it should not be susceptible to tumah. However, and all the more so, even if now what they're talking about is even if it is susceptible to tumah because it's a bowl, but then you make it a permanent installation of a house, right? Like you make it part of the furniture, you make it a built-in, like the sink, right? The sink of a house does not become tameh in the same way that a bowl would, right? And so when you attach it to the house, you are going to change its status about whether it's susceptible to tumah or not. At least according to some of the opinions, but not all. So we're trying to keep it straight. Okay. So the Gemara responds, actually, one can explain that the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, but the law governing flat wooden vessels without a receptacle, such as a baker's board, is different, as they are vessels susceptible to ritual impurity only by rabbinic law. So they are susceptible to tumah, but only by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. So what that means is, in a case of when something is, susceptible to tumah by Torah law, if we have a doubt whether it actually came into contact with the source of the impurity or not, then we rule stringently. But if something is susceptible to tumah only by rabbinic law, and we have a doubt whether or not it came into contact with something that would transmit impurity, tumah, and there's that doubt, then we rule leniently, right? So in cases that hinge on rabbinic law, cases of doubt are lenient. And in cases that hinge on Torah law, if we have a case of doubt or uncertainty, then we have to rule stringently. So that's one of the important differences between something by Torah law versus something by rabbinic law. Okay. So here we're saying Rabbi Eliezer, it is in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, but the law governing flat wooden vessels without a receptacle, such as a baker's board, is different because they can contract impurity, tumah, but only by rabbinic law. Whereas by Torah law, they are not vessels susceptible to ritual impurity. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer agrees that when the baker's board is affixed to the wall, it is no longer subject to the rabbinic decree, right? Because now there's a case of doubt. We further removed it by attaching it to the wall, and so now it's not susceptible to tumah. So a hollowed out duct, however, is a vessel that is susceptible to tumah by Torah law, and it remains so even if afterward it was affixed to the ground. Therefore, the water flowing through it invalidates a mikvah. And the Gemara asks by inference from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer is more stringent in the case of the duct and distinguishes between a duct that was first hollowed out and only afterward affixed to the ground, and one that was first affixed to the ground and only afterward hollowed out. Does it not follow that the law governing drawn water, i.e. that drawn water added to a mikvah that does not already contain the necessary quantity of water, would invalidate it, and that this applies by Torah law? Now we're on page 66b, and we're almost done. So questions or comments, please get them in. But this is difficult, as we maintain that the law that drawn water invalidates a mikvah applies only by rabbinic decree. And furthermore, does Rabbi Yosei ben Rabbi Hanina say that the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis is with regard to a board of metal and a metal vessel, even if it is flat and lacks a receptacle, is susceptible to ritual impurity even by Torah law? And this means that according to Rabbi Eliezer, even a vessel that is susceptible to tumah by Torah law loses its status as a vessel when it is affixed to the ground. Consequently, the question returns, whose opinion is cited in the Baraisa that states that if one first hollowed out a duct and afterward affixed it to the ground, it is still considered a vessel and water flowing through it would invalidate a mikvah. But if he first affixed it to the ground and only afterward hollowed it out, the water flowing through it does not invalidate the mikvah. According to whose opinion is that? And the Gemara answers, actually, one can explain that the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who deem the baker's metal board susceptible to ritual impurity, even when it is affixed to the wall, but the law governing drawn water added to a deficient mikvah is different, because drawn water invalidates a deficient mikvah only by rabbinic law, and therefore the rabbis could be and were lenient. So the Gemara asks, if so, then even if one first hollowed out the duct and only afterward fixed it to the ground, water flowing through it should not invalidate the mikvah as well. And the Gemara answers, it is different there, where the duct was hollowed out before being affixed to the ground, as the duct had the status of a vessel when it was still detached from the ground, and therefore the rabbis were not willing to be lenient to such an extent and rule that water flowing through the duct does not invalidate the mikvah. Okay. Not easy. Hopefully you followed it. All right, let's take some questions or comments on Bava Basra 65 and 66. Short but punchy pages. Reload. Come on. Okay, Sharon. Sharon, can the new owners of the house change the locks like current owner would do under these circumstances, selling the house but not the keep? I mean, I think they could do whatever they want, certainly. I think that the only thing we're talking about is because the parties were not specific what was being included. The buyer thought the key was included, the seller thought the key was not included. They didn't specify, and so here we're learning that the key is not necessarily part of the house. It's detached. It's almost like, you can buy all kinds of gadgets that you take with you to lock a hotel room at night from the inside. There's like a stick that becomes a wedge. There's a different kind of wedge. There's all kinds of attachments for people, who want to feel safe in a hotel room that bad guys can't come in. Obviously those things are small and so you can travel with them. But I think it's that kind of idea that the key in Talmudic times was more of an extra measure of security and not, just the little metal object that is uniquely made for the lock, opens the lock. And it sounds like later it did become more like that, and so therefore the key was understood to be part of the locking mechanism and particular to that house, and then the ruling changed, right? So it's really, is it the kind of key that we would say is specifically and particular to this house and this door and this lock, or is it something that could be just as useful in the next house that the owner moves to? Bill, when we sold Nana's house after she passed, we very specifically did not include the kitchen stove because it was brand new and we had only just installed it a few weeks before. So I get the importance of distinguishing that an appliance that is otherwise viewed as part of the building is maybe not always properly regarded as such. Good example. Sharon, my dad was a plumber and did the plumbing in the local mikvah in my hometown. Wow. And he had not had direct contact with a mikvah since he left Poland and was really engaged in the process. And there were areas of concern that were so different than the mikvahs of Poland because there are local building codes for plumbing that had to dovetail with the religious regulations. And I remember discussing this with him. It's so interesting. Yes, 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 and yes. I've had a conversation with a friend of mine, Michael, here in Hancock Park in LA, who's an architect who designed one of the local synagogues that has a mikvah in the cellar. And he had to explain at length and over again to the Los Angeles, building department, whatever it's called, the code inspectors, why he was designing this very unusual roof structure to gather water and to funnel that water, down to the mikveh in the cellar. And I mean, there was just all kinds of particularities about it that the building inspectors had never seen before, could not understand, couldn't get their heads around, kept objecting to. And it really was, it caused a lot of bother and trouble and fuss, but they got it done. So I'm sure your dad could understand. Bill, I don't know that we can quite say that the Jubilee year is a sounds good, doesn't work idea, mostly because I'm not overly comfortable saying any law that God explicitly gives in the Torah is sounds good but doesn't work. I agree with you, and I should not have spoken so brusquely. Rather, it seems to me, the prosbul is created only late in the Second Temple period when Israel is under the Roman yoke, because they no longer really possess the capacity to enforce good behavior from the rich by any other means. The Romans, of all people, weren't going to support the Jubilee redistribution. The Torah obviously says as well that it is impious and inappropriate for the rich to hide themselves from their own flesh and blood by refusing to lend. But by that point, the spiritual level of the people had dropped so low that injunction was no longer sufficient to ensure good behavior. Thus, to spare the poor, the sages, with, it seems to me, gritted teeth, created the prosbul. I think that's a good analysis. And you're absolutely right that they didn't need a prosbul for the first 1,000 years that the people lived in the land. I'm also brought to think about what we read every day in the Shema, in the middle paragraph. Basically, just to summarize and paraphrase, that if you will follow all these laws and love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and do everything that you're supposed to do, then the land will yield up its fruit, and you will eat and be satisfied. Your cattle will eat. You will have the early rain, the late rain, your grain, your wine, your oil, etc. But if you turn away and you serve the gods of others, then God's anger will blaze at you, and he will restrain the heavens. The rain will not come, the land will dry up, and ultimately you will be forced out of the land. Now, that wasn't an overnight thing, right? That was part of a long decline. And so that decline was both a spiritual decline and, we might say, a prosperity decline. Right, so when the people as a whole, or at least there were more people among the people following the law, heeding all the commandments, shomer mitzvah, shomer Torah. So maybe there was more prosperity to go around, less need. And as the people became more and more corrupted, less and less religious, less and less honoring the Torah the way they were supposed to, and ultimately the temple was destroyed and not rebuilt, they were thrust out, etc. Probably there was greater need. There were more people who were more needy, and hence the sages did what they could, to alleviate that strain. It's sort of like, putting a patch on a tire that was leaking and that was not able to really fix the tire. That's just me thinking aloud. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon.